So are we turning it over to Ms. Spring?
We sure are. She is our finance expert. And so the two of us will tag team a little bit. I'll be adding commentary where I feel like I can add some benefit. But Ms. Spring will lead us through this great workshop.
Wonderful.
This is what we've gone through just about every year. So for some of you, it's just a refresher. But for our newer board members, it's just the whole process of budgeting in a school district, and we're just going to go through this because the next few months, that's all we're going to be thinking about until you adopt a budget in October. So there's the PowerPoint. I don't know, Dan, if you can get that up. So we'll just go right into stay focused on the why. So we're creating this budget. Why? You know, it's all about the educational opportunities for kids, and yet the board has to balance that with the impact on our taxpayers. But we always try to remember that the basic is our opportunities for instruction. Wisconsin Constitution. So this has been in our Constitution that we shall provide by law district schools which shall be nearly uniform as practicable, and such schools shall be free without charge for tuition for all children between the ages of 4 and 20. So there is no tuition charged, and there is no tuition revenue. So this is just, we have over 400 districts in the state of Wisconsin, and we are all under the same rules. The state provides financial assistance in the form of equalization, or sometimes referred to as general aid. It is the same thing. And it was established to reduce the reliance on our local taxpayers and guarantee a source that a basic educational opportunity is available for all pupils, no matter what kind of district they live in. So our revenue limit history, we've been under revenue limits for over 30 years. And the goal was to create levy controls for Wisconsin school districts so that one school district, maybe in a wealthier area, could tax more and get more for their district. So it tells us, the calculation is how much revenue can a district get through the two sources, only two sources, the general state aid and our local tax levy. So it also says that we can have referendums if calculation provided insufficient funds. And so we know that there are referendum options that many school districts, including La Crosse, have gone to. So just for comparison's sake, a lot of you are familiar with business accounting. You have your businesses, you have a balance sheet, your assets minus your liabilities equals your equity. You have profit and loss. If you are experiencing increased expenses, you increase your revenues through your sales, and that provides your net income. However, in a school district, we have fund accounting. It's fun, and it's fund accounting. So we have the general fund, we have the special education fund, we have the food service fund, we have many other funds which we'll go into. But it's important to know as board members that our special education fund is not fully funded by the state. So what that means is that at the end of the school year, our special ed fund has to be zero. And that means that every year we take $10 million or more from our general fund and transfer it to our special education fund to cover the expenditures that are not covered by state aid. Food service, I brought this one up too because it pretty much is a standalone fund. It should be, the revenues need to meet the expenditures. And again, if a fund balance, we run into a deficit fund balance in food service, we have to move funds from our instructional fund of an operating fund of Fund 10 to cover that deficit. So here are the funds that you should probably be familiar with. Each of these funds has a budget that is developed. The general fund and the special education fund are our main operating funds. Debt service is a separate fund, so that Fund 38 is for non-referendum debt. So sometimes a district can go into debt without going to referendum, and we would pay it back through Fund 38. And we levy partial amount for that payback of Fund 38 debt. Fund 39 is our referendum debt. So when our referendum is passed, we spoke earlier about the $53.5 million cost to build, but the cost to repay would go through Fund 39, and then we would levy for that. Capital projects, Fund 40s, that's what Joe had talked about, or Mr. Levina. All of the capital improvements go through Fund 40. Food service is our school nutrition.
40, so there must be several different capital improvement funds?
Yes.
Yes, there are. Yes, so we have our Fund 41 that might be for, well, that one actually is our tax levy, is Fund 41. But then we have our Fund 49, which is like if we had a sale of a building, that money would go into Fund 49, and it would be there to support other future projects that have to do with buildings. Food service, Fund 50, and then community service, Fund 80, which is a separate levy that the board will have to
Ms. Sprang,
approve. Mhm.
one of the questions I
Yep.
think would be good to try to answer as well is that, for example, transportation and special education is not only just the school district of La Crosse, but some of our other schools that are within our community.
Correct. So we are totally responsible for the cost of transportation of students in our district to both public schools and private schools. We cover the cost of transportation to private schools.
And what are the private schools we deliver children to every day?
Aquinas,
A couple Lutheran schools?
yes,
Providence?
elementary schools, any school districts within our district.
And the same with special education?
Special education, we also cover the cost of special education at a private school. So, school budget overview. So I've used this analogy a few times, but it's much like forecasting the weather. The closer we get to October, the closer we know all the components that make up the revenue and our expenditures, and we are better equipped. So, at this point, we're still estimating, and we will continue to estimate all the way through to September when we give you a preliminary budget, but then you do not finalize that until the end of October. And our fiscal year starts July 1st, but by statute, we're allowed to spend dollars out of our next year's budget in order to maintain and operate the school district during those months. So yep.
Sorry.
Mhm.
Do you know roughly like what percentage of our yearly expenditures are happening in that period where we're like outside of the budget? You said
Oh,
our- is it-
sure.
Right.
Sure. I would just say, 3 months of the fiscal year,
And
July, August, September is your expenditures that,
Are literally without a budget. So a quarter of
Mhm.
our fiscal year
Yep.
is done without necessarily knowing what the funds are gonna be from the state, because we haven't set a budget until the end of October.
correct.
And we don't
Mhm.
get property valuations until mid-October.
Mhm.
We don't know equalization aid until
October 1st.
October. Yeah, so we don't even know the money the state's gonna give us until October, so we can't possibly set a levy until after we have all of that. We don't know mill rate impacts until we know the valuation of the school district. Like Ms. Sprang said, we have estimates for all of those things, and Ms. Sprang does a very detailed estimate of what will be based on everything that we already know, and is very close to what it ought to be, but we don't know for sure until that last point.
So for instance, we know what the biennial budget had for per pupil increase. And we can look
Right.
at last year's numbers and say, okay, plus that increase will be in rough,
Not necessarily.
Not
But also remember that prior to this last biennium, where the governor set the amount for 400 years? Every 2 years, it was a complete Wild West.
well,
and
it's
not knowing,
still
right,
open
of-
to change in the next 2
Yeah,
years.
well, it was a little easier when the biennium budget was passed in that middle year, because it was already set. But
Right.
that second year, or the first year of the biennium was always
Right.
a crazy time.
And it still will be,
Yeah.
the $350 or whatever it is.
$325, yeah.
for 400 years is only as good as the next biennium,
That's what I
so,
mean, like, it's still
you know,
subject to change.
and then there's been more Supreme Court activity lately, so there's chances for things there as well. So it has the same level of uncertainty as the weather. Until it's
Yes.
raining, you don't really want to feel confident in reporting the weather.
Right.
That is true. So,
You can't be a weatherman and just say 50-50 chance.
It does not work the same way.
so,
Oh, Ms.
so,
Has the percentage per student gone up any in the last 5 years? How much?
yes, I mean,
Ms. Sprang
the
has
aid-
a list here a little bit later.
Okay.
So, how we budget, so each fund, as we had talked about, has its own budget, and expenses are budgeted by fund and function, meaning the purpose of those dollars. So all of your 100,000 function numbers are going to do with instructional needs. Revenues are budgeted by fund and source, where the dollars are coming from. So for example, 210 are property taxes. So Fund 10 and Fund 27 are the bulk of the district's budget. That is because that is what covers our salaries and benefits. And remember that 80% of the whole budget is salary and benefits. So that is the main driver, then is our revenue limit.
With the state, they have this thing called the Wisconsin Uniform Financial Accounting Regulation, WUFR. And it indicates that for every type of expense and revenue, there's a specific number that must be associated with it. And we send all that information to the state every year, and it's all publicly accessible and then audited through our local audit. And so it's a very highly regulated process.
Every school district in the state has the same chart of accounts.
But there's, Milwaukee Schools hasn't been sending theirs in, I thought I heard that in the news that there's.
Yes, we
And
did
we
hear
don't know
that.
the details there,
I'm
of
glad we are
course.
not like
I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
I'm going, in terms of the expenditure for, a comparison between what we spend on special ed in comparable districts, are they pretty similar? Do you know that number? I mean,
Most school districts transfers about 10%. It, obviously, it can fluctuate a little bit, you know, between school districts, but, and for smaller school districts, it's certainly more variability. And it kind of depends on the programs you have as well. If you've got inclusion programs, it might be a lower expense than if you have magnet programs, which collect kids in one site, you know, so, but I,
It depends on the population. I mean, how many?
no, I understand that, but on the average, we can say, hey, listen, every school this size has X number special ed. I can't see that Appleton has more or less on an average than La
it's
Crosse.
about 18% of our students, and it's about 10 to 12% of our expenditures that we transfer, and then there's the 30%, you know, so, you know,
The
But-
10 to 12 is the 10 million we expense from the large.
correct.
Mhm.
But of those expenses in special ed, when you talk about the number of students in our district, does that also include the private school students that are also, we are paying for, that we do not get revenue from the private schools for, right? So, I mean, that's another thing to consider, is that if the amount we spend in special ed will also be impacted by how many private schools are within the school district, how many students are being served in those districts, and some places may not have any, some places may have more, even if they're comparably sized.
How much do we spend per year covering the special ed costs at private schools, on average?
Well, they'd be wrapped into our regular Fund 27 because it's our staff that are going into those
Oh,
schools.
okay,
So, you know,
okay.
depending on who the staff
you can't
is or
really
what
divide it
services
out.
are
Okay,
needed.
I didn't realize that's how it was delivered,
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, speech and language services and other things, occupational therapy, they'll go to those schools and deliver those services on site.
Deaf and hard of hearing, visually impaired.
Mhm.
Do we track hours at private sites?
Pardon?
Do we track staff hours at private sites?
We typically allocate by FTE.
Okay,
We don't do time
right. So if I'm,
reporting.
if I'm a 1 FTE special ed teacher, I might have like 0.25
Mhm.
offsite,
Yep, yeah.
and
the
that's
ten-
written in though?
Yep, we
And
notify our teachers what their assignment is, and then that's tracked.
I think, I mean, we also do that with our high school, you know, like
Mhm.
English teachers
Right.
might have a split between Central and Logan, right? So, I mean, yeah, my assumption is they would know, and that conversation would happen before the start of the year.
So if it's just a special education transportation, does that mean we cover them for, say, they have a field trip anywhere?
No, not a field trip. It's the to and from,
All right, so there are limits to what we do.
So, so this is the way we have to consider the revenue limit, that it's made up of those two forms of aid. So it's our local taxes compared to our state aid. And so that's the outer rim. That's what we're working within. And then, as the state aid increases or decreases for each district, the local tax relief valve adjusts inversely. So if we're getting more in state aid, then we have less of an impact on our taxpayers. If we have more, less state aid, remember, it's based on every other district in the state, so that can impact us differently each year. So the next one is like the different flavors of pie. So if you're in a property wealth district, you're going to get more of your aid from your local taxpayers because they feel like the your community can afford to support your school district. And in a district that's a poor district, then they're going to have more state aid. So if you think about some of those districts up north that have high property value because of all the vacation homes, some of them don't get any state aid. They rely solely on the local taxpayers.
I have a question, just got me thinking as you're talking
Mhm.
about this. So, it was said earlier at the meeting that our tax rate, our mill rate has gone down
Mhm.
over the last 10 years. Does that include the operating referendum?
Yes.
So that is included inside that mill rate, or is that a
Yes.
separate assessment?
That's an operating referendum increases your revenue limit overall.
Yeah, so it's all our entire tax rate.
I think the bigger impact would be, even though the revenue limit may increase, that if your property value district-wide also increases, it's more property to disperse that levy rate above. So the dollars might increase, but if our property values are increasing too, the mill rate will go down.
And that's because this number, like the revenue limit, as suggested by limit, doesn't change, right?
Right.
So if we get more state aid, we just take less money from local taxpayers. If we have less state aid, we take more money. And so I think that sometimes confuses the public when they're like, but the state gave you all this money.
Yes, yes.
And you're like, yeah, and your property taxes went down. Like the schools didn't get that.
Kids did not benefit.
Kids didn't
Right.
benefit from that.
Right,
Yeah, it's the difference between state aid and revenue limit.
yes.
I think it's interesting what Deb just brought up, though, that I don't think a lot of people realize that that's included, referendum is
Hadn't we
included in all
cycled
that
off
as
some
well.
debt? Is that part of why? I feel like the district, I can't remember because it was right at the beginning of my coming on.
Sure, there's so many different elements in
Yeah.
that revenue limit. So you have your base revenue limit, but then you have exemptions, like the vouchers. We never know how much those are gonna be from year to year. Those increase our revenue limit. Our operating referendum increases our revenue limit. That's why we have to go out to the taxpayers for referendums, because somewhere they're increasing either the revenue limit or the levy as a whole, which is made up of paying back debt. That would be a capital referendum. Operating referendum is in the revenue limit total. So you're right, that there's that pie, but within it is going to impact how the taxpayers are impacted. But a capital referendum is outside that revenue limit. So the revenue limit factors, the critical factors is the base revenue, the prior year revenue limit, because all of those exemptions, a lot of them are just one-time exemptions. They don't increase that base. The membership, of course, is the students, the full-time equivalency of students, and then the annual change per member. So this is where I have a note that the state biennial budget dictates that amount. So we know for 2 years, in 21 to 23 state budget, they allowed 0 increase per student, and they did that many years since 2011. And then in 2023 to the 2025 state budget, they increased it to 325. And that's important because that amount in that area does increase that base revenue, stays with it year to year. And that is what we like to see. So then I had talked about allowable exemptions to the limit, meaning beyond the base are those things, like operating referendum, voucher schools, things like that. The membership does not equal the students in the seats. I'll say this over and over again as I'm talking about the budget. So the students in the seats, that's an important number because we have to know how many students we have to serve, how much space we need, how many teachers do we need, right? But the membership is our students that live within our district, whether they go to La Crosse Public School or they open and roll out to another public school, we are still fiscally responsible for them. The students that come here from Onalaska, we do not count those in our revenue limit. Onalaska counts those students.
And there's a reason for a three-year rolling average, correct?
Yes, so so when you're experiencing declining enrollment in a rapid way, that three-year rolling average helps to lessen the impact on districts that are rapidly increasing or rapidly decreasing in students. The allowable per member adjustment, so that is that amount of $325. That is the amount that we really want to see happen per student on an annual basis. It increases our base. But a drop in the revenue limit membership, so remember that membership, it might offset any increase. And that's kind of what's happening here in La Crosse, that we've just experienced so much declining enrollment over the years that, that sometimes that increase is not helpful. As much as it could be, I should say. It's always helpful. So this is the chart we were talking about, Mr. Bagneski, about how the per member adjustment inside the revenue limit has changed through the years. So back in 2011-12, that was Act 10, where every district experienced a drop. They took money away from us and from our base. And then over the years, they used small amounts, but there were quite a few years, as you can see, that there was zero increase. So that did not increase our base until this current year. The other column is per pupil categorical aid, and that is one-time dollars outside of the revenue limit, so it is another source of revenue. So we like to point that out, that there is some source of revenue outside the revenue limit. Both dictated by the state budget, though. So the revenue limit calculation is the membership times the maximum revenue per member equals the revenue limit with exemptions. So this is where we talk about if the membership or the maximum revenue per member increase, the pie crust limit can get bigger. That revenue limit can get bigger.
Mr. Mika?
Yeah, so I'm noticing right here the one-time per pupil categorical, that increase kind of during the pandemic. Are we expecting to maintain that after the pandemic? That's more like the state trend, but am I reading that correctly?
The 742. Yeah.
Starting from 2019 to 2020.
Yeah, and like I said, it's dictated by the state budget.
Yeah.
So every 2 years it could change.
So the school districts that are property rich, where they have to have most of their finances, most of their school revenues come from local taxes, they preferred this per pupil categorical aid because it was money straight from the state instead of raised locally. Whereas school districts that were property poor, who had most of their funding come from the state, they didn't really care where it came from, and it was fine to have it in the equalized revenue limit, you know. So the incentive behind this per pupil categorical aid was to functionally play nice to the suburbs around Milwaukee, because they were taxing a lot locally, and so this would help their taxpayers support funding for public education, because it didn't come out of their tax base, it came out of the state pockets.
All right, so revenue limit versus state aid. So what you can spend is the pie, the revenue limit, and how much you receive in general school aids. Part of the filling are two different things, so that there's that thought that's always out in the newspapers. School districts are getting an increase in state aid. All that means is that your pie stays the same, but more is being paid by the state and less is being paid by the taxpayers. Doesn't increase any ability to spend. So the general school aids are a purposeful tax relief, and the main general school aid program is equalization aid. It's one pot of money distributed among all of the schools. So final points is there's a special adjustment or a hold harmless that keeps our aid from falling more than 15% per year. And then more aid means less to tax, not more to spend. It has to be combined with a revenue limit increase to make resources available. And that's what an operating referendum does. It increases our resources. Aid formula assumes value per member is the best measure of ability to pay, and the redistribution is the intent for one district to get more, other districts have to get less. So remember, it's just one pot of money statewide, and if it all
Milwaukee
shakes
gets a
out.
report in, then we'll know how much we all get.
But I think Milwaukee's even funded differently. It's a separate allocation that may not be included with the rest of us.
Mhm.
First class.
Mhm.
I do have a question. So when the operating referendum was passed a year ago, the argument was that the state funding has decreased, and so we need this operating referendum. Now you're saying if the state gives us more money, it doesn't increase the pie, it just means less for local money. So I feel like those conversations don't align, and what am I missing?
I think one thing, if I can, you'll probably answer this better, so maybe I should let you answer.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking about it, I was looking back to the budget book, because you had put on the slide in 2011, 2012, that it went down by 5.5%.
Mhm.
And the dollar value in the old budget book was around $612, which means just last year, we caught up with what we were spending in 2010 on education. But we know we've had 10 years of inflation, and we know we've had 10 years of maintenance and stuff like that. That's cost more every year. But we are still, just last year, caught up to what we were spending 10 years prior.
If we had received inflationary increases from 2008 onward, that's when they decoupled inflation, the additional spending we would have per student is $3,200 per student. that
Above what we
would-
currently
Above
have.
what we currently have right now. That would amount to $18 million that we would have to spend on public education that the state has underfunded since 2008.
So when the information was put out during that operating referendum, was it about decreases in state funding, or was it about decreases in revenue limits?
They did not increase revenue limits, and so we didn't have new state funding.
And all those years for zeros were years that there were no revenue limit increase, which means what we spent was stagnating even while we were getting 8% inflation.
It means our
So-
pie was the same
then-
size despite our expenses going.
Increasing, yeah.
Alright, so,
Right.
so what I'm hearing is place more of a burden on the local taxes.
Burden on taxes actually went down.
The burden on
The way
teachers.
so the state throughout that period of time advertised, both the governor and the legislature, that they spent historic amounts of money on public education, but it just went in to the pie being the same size, and the amount that was for local property taxes just went down. They were buying down property taxes the whole time, not giving us new money to spend in public education.
Okay, I understand.
But the operational referendum raises the revenue limit.
Correct.
So
So
then
we
we
make the
have
pie
more
bigger.
money per student to spend,
Right.
and then we can start to meet inflationary.
Right, that I understand.
things.
So the revenue limit sets the size of the pie,
Correct.
and how much the state pays,
And how much taxpayers pay.
how much
Is
the
filling.
taxpayers fill out, whatever the state pays, the taxpayer pays a difference for the size of the pie.
Correct.
Yes.
So when the revenue limits remain unchanged, I can understand why we would need a referendum, because we need a bigger pie. That makes sense. But for us to say we need an operating referendum because the state funding went down doesn't make sense, because we just said we fill in the rest with local dollars.
Well, remember, there's two different, we're talking about equalization aid is different than the revenue limit. So you're building the revenue limit, and that per pupil amount is within that base revenue limit, okay?
Right.
And if you don't increase that per pupil, you can't increase that revenue limit, base revenue
You
limit.
don't increase the size of the pie.
Right. So we put in an operating referendum, so we could increase the size of the pie.
I understand that, but I'm trying to understand when we said the argument to have an operating referendum was decrease state dollars. That seems
Sure.
like,
So at a-
that seems
at a-
confusing to me.
Yeah,
But
I-
I'm trying, maybe I
Yep.
didn't hear,
Nope,
Nope.
it's one thing that we didn't mention, so Patty talked about membership. With declining enrollment, the size of our pie has actually been getting smaller.
So we get
Oh,
fewer
sure,
state
sure.
dollars.
Yeah,
So
because
with
6
fewer
of the last
kids,
10
we have, our
years.
pie gets smaller, and the challenge with declining enrollment is, let's say that we have 2 kids that we declined in enrollment at each of our elementary schools. So 18 students we lose, 2 at each elementary school. They're not in the same classrooms, they're spread out across the district. Let's say it's just $10,000, and it's closer to 13, but at $10,000, you'd be talking $180,000 of lost revenue. And we can't cut a single teacher, principal, AA, cook, custodian, because they're spread out across the district. So we have,
Our facility.
nor a facility, yep,
I
so
mean,
we have.
even if you lose 100 of them over a number of years, we got 9 elementary schools, that's still
Right.
only 11 at the
Correct.
school.
Maybe
So-
you can cut a teacher or two if they kind of happen in the right spots, but the problem with our funding formula is it's really hard to shrink. We can't cut our expenses fast enough, and still provide the same quality education we want to. And so our pie has actually been shrinking, with fewer students in our school district.
That makes sense, that part makes sense.
I think that's what the key right there with the fewer students.
Correct.
Well, we get less
Makes
real
a
dollars.
lot more sense
Yeah.
now, yeah.
Yeah.
We get fewer actual dollars because we have fewer students and the state pays per student, but we also, the state hasn't raised the revenue limit, right? They've chosen to spend that money to pay down taxes rather than raise the revenue limit for students.
Absolutely.
So the state could say, we're gonna give 22 million to education, we're gonna raise the revenue limit. But that's not what they say. They say, we're gonna give 22 million to education, we're gonna lower your taxes. And so
It's a choice,
the pie stays the same.
right, or
Yeah.
smaller.
Right, and in
And
fact,
this-
yeah, and 6 of the last 10 budgetary years here, right, with 0
Yeah.
for pupil increase.
Which
Our
means-
pie gets
Yeah,
smaller, but our
teachers'
expenses are
lanes and
growing,
steps were
yeah.
frozen, like,
Right.
teachers were the ones who carried the burden
Right.
of that.
That is true. Good discussion. So, I think after that, we're gonna go into what are referenda. This is very important. I know that at some of our, sessions, meeting with the public, they're often confused about referenda. School districts use 2 forms, capital and, operating. We don't go to advisory, referendums, as do, counties and cities might go, or the state. So,
Is that by statute, or why don't we,
Yep.
that is,
okay.
we
We
go
are
by
not
cert,
allowed
we
to.
There's a
usually.
question about that at the last
Yeah,
listening session, and I knew we didn't do it, but I wasn't sure if it was statutory.
Yeah,
What is a advisory referendum?
that is more so for a county, changing a law, the state.
They're
So-
just trying to figure out
Marijuana.
the straw poll.
Yeah.
Right.
Counties recently have been
North-south
asking,
corridor.
should we
Does the
legalize
community support,
marijuana?
you know,
And
yeah.
then it supports a future state policy issue.
So a referendum grants revenue authority, so it has a tax impact, but it doesn't raise taxes by a specific dollar amount. And that is because, remember, you're paying back, right? You're paying back the debt, which does include interest. We're not paying back the cost of building the building, okay? And then the impact depends on how the funds are used and where you live in the aid formula. And then the vote for one of 2 things. Either we're gonna issue debt for a specific purpose, that's what our November referendum is about, or we're gonna raise additional dollars for operations, and that's what our referendum was about in April of 2023. So issue debt. So we're gonna borrow a specific amount of money for a specific purpose. So that 53.5 million, we had to come up with that before all of you could agree on a resolution for the referendum. And so, and also, I think you found out when you were discussing that the wording of the question is very important. The revenue authority is whatever you need to make the debt payments over 20 years. So you won't know until you actually issue the debt, because we won't know what the interest rates are. We try to schedule our debt so that when debt is running off, that it can be scheduled to have as little impact on our taxpayers as possible. And then we work with a financial advisor to forecast those impacts, and that's very
Is-
important. and
Is the
what we-
20-year just something we choose to do? Could it be 30-year? Could it be 10-year? Is it, why, how did the 20, I'm not arguing it should be 20,
No,
I'm just
20
wondering where it
years, I
came from.
think, is our limit of time that we can issue debt. However, we can break that up, that 20 years. So we could issue debt for 10 years, because maybe the interest rates aren't as favorable now, but we see that maybe they'll be more favorable later, and we can issue the debt further on. And depending on your project, how much money do you need right now, right? So there's different options. In fact,
At certain points, it's callable too, and when I first came
Yep.
here, Ms. Sprang refinanced our debt and saved $1 million in interest. You know, so there's opportunities at certain points to get our taxpayers a better deal too.
And we can do that regardless of how the referendum was structured, right? So we
Correct.
have a 20-year period, we can refinance just like mortgages.
so in operating to exceed the revenue limit, this one here is talking about a recurring operating referendum, meaning that it adds to that base of revenue limit, builds on it from year to year. Taxpayers don't usually favor that kind of referendum, so ours, as you know, is a non-recurring referendum, meaning that we had to say that, you know, it's going to be impacting us through the 28-29 school year. And then we'll reassess, you know, probably a year before that. What do we need to do as far as going out for another operating referendum?
So in this visualization here, with this kind of referendum, we've asked the taxpayers to increase our pie and to allow that to be the new standard pie. And that assumes no additional state increase in the revenue limit.
Correct.
That graphic,
For
the
those
way that,
years.
that actually.
For those years of
Right.
the referendum.
Right, okay.
Right.
Dan, can you go to the next slide? And so then this is the non-recurring, it's only there for a period of time. The pie gets bigger for a little bit, then it goes back to the previous size.
Yeah, there's a school district not too far from here that had a recurring, it's very unpopular, and they were very unhappy with a lot of school staff about it. It's recurring, it's there, you can't do anything about it.
It goes forever then. So a note on the referenda. Also, in the 2017-2019 biennial budget, they added significant restrictions on how school districts could go to referendum, or when they could go. So remember, we had that limit of 2 questions per calendar year. It's a calendar year, not even a fiscal year, and only held with a scheduled regular election. So in the even years, that's the spring and fall, and the primary and general, and then the odd years are the spring primary and the general. So if you use up your 2 questions on one ballot and it doesn't pass, you're out of luck for that year. You have to kind of think ahead, and that's why when you go out to operating referendum, you try to really think ahead and maybe go a little earlier, that it won't impact voters till later, but at least that helps you plan, and if it fails, to be able to resubmit it to the voters at a later date.
And this is true of both capital and operational referenda?
Yes.
The limit covers both kinds?
Yes.
Okay.
Total.
So if we would've had 2 questions for this referendum, we would be out of luck for another year.
It's a
Well, we were
calendar
within the
year.
calendar year.
Calendar
so,
year.
yeah.
You'd have
We could still
opportunity
go
in
And we
in
didn't have an
April.
April.
April of 20, so the odd years, like that's when we went out for the operating last year. It's also good to note that it's very confusing to taxpayers to go out for a capital and an operating referendum in the same year. So then you try to structure your referenda to be opposite years.
Mr. Badminski, you were trying to ask a question.
One question,
Mhm.
A, B, C, is that one question?
Three parts.
ABC, yeah, no,
You only
yeah,
have
that'd
A,
be three
B,
questions, actually, yeah.
Is that
You're
one
giving,
question or is that three?
it's three, so if you're asking three different things, then it's three different
One
questions.
question.
Yeah. Yeah.
We wish they accepted multiple choice.
Mhm.
I don't know, do we?
Ranked choice.
Now, we do get revenues outside of the revenue limit formula. Next slide, Dan. These are federal and state aids. But all of these are budgeted for in the same way. Revenue is gonna match expenditure. Now, most of these are, we have to expense them first, and then we're reimbursed. We submit for reimbursement. So that's another reason why you want to have a healthy fund balance, so we can spend on these grant needs and be able to have them in and then get reimbursed later. So that's why we consider how long a grant is and what the grant expenses will be. But in your budget that you'll approve, these are always gonna, revenues match expenditures, so they don't impact your fund balance overall.
And some of these expenses are a good reason to have fund balance on hand, because we might not get reimbursed for them for a year after the expenses have been made. And a lot of these are very highly regulated, especially all the titles, those are federal funds. And so there's a lot of oversight, and they're very much sticklers about what can and cannot be accounted for in those funds. So it really.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
There are further, help though with special education, correct? I mean, it's not just our state, we get some federal funding.
We get federal funding and we get state categorical aid. Our state categorical aid for special ed is based on the expenditures of this current fiscal year, but we don't get the money until the next. So, let's see.
And that's why we have to have a reserve account to be able to cash flow those.
Fund balance.
Correct. So the next one is the revenues outside the revenue limit formula. So most districts' operational revenue is determined by the state and federal calculation allocations. Other revenue, small percent of the overall budget. So all of those grants are just a small percentage of our budget. And then long-term budgeting considerations for, balanced budgets begin with revenue estimates. And then we consider the revenue longevity when determining the related expense. And this has come into play especially when you've heard of the ESSER funds that are expiring in September of this year.
So by revenue longevity, if we get an ESSER grant for 4 years, that's the longevity of that revenue we're putting in our balance sheet.
Mm-hmm. Yep, or we might get a grant for, what was the mental health one that we just had? Project Aware. It was a pretty sizable grant, but we knew it was gonna run out at a certain point, so you have to thoughtfully prepare how to spend that out and then to live without it on the back end of it. And sometimes we can pursue other grants or other sources of funding to offset it. Sometimes it just goes away, and that's okay. We did a good thing.
So for 24-25, these are some of the things that, it says, I think that's supposed to be factors. It's kind of got cut off. The second year of the state biennial budget, so that's good because we know what those per pupil amounts are going to be, so that's very helpful. And that is the $325 per both of the years of the state budget. And then that per pupil categorical aid, that's $742, we know. The special ed aid, it's still estimated at 33% of the prior year aidable costs. So that's, we never really know. Hopefully it's around 30%, but the governor had submitted a budget that wanted 60% of special ed expenditures reimbursed, but that was not agreed upon. We are still working with the numbers that we gave you back in March, so declining enrollment, our estimate is a loss of 117 FTE. But as you can see, the exact number, we won't know until the third Friday count in September. So that's one of those things that we keep estimating. Then there's also the CPI salary increase. So the suggested increase is for this year is 4.12%, but we always have to weigh that versus the affordable salary. What can the district afford? When we went out to operating referendum, one of our main thing is we want to be able to provide an increase to our employees every year. We may not make it to whatever the CPI is for that year, but at least we can still give them a raise, which is important because, as we have said, there have been years where there has been no raise, and that is hard. Staffing needs, of course, we're always taking into consideration our staffing needs, and that's kind of ongoing, and we had talked about that earlier, that people are leaving, but we're replacing, and then the cost of those replacements. You know, if you have a veteran teacher retire, then the cost maybe to replace them, if you're not replacing with a veteran teacher, is going to be less. So that, you know, so we look at those things constantly throughout the summer.
Do we, in the school district, would you say the staff is the right middle age, upper middle age, lower? Do you have that?
As far as our teaching staff, we have, I'd say, a great percentage of our teachers are highly qualified. They're in our highest pay range. So we are very lucky to still maintain that. That has changed over the years, but it's still, we have very highly qualified teachers. So the 2024 budget projections, starting deficit. Now, I only put this first page of, but also if you click on the link, is the information that we brought to the board back in March. So those of you that are new, you'll probably want to look at that because it goes into not only the changes in revenue, but all of our assumptions of added increases to expenditures, then how are we going to make some adjustments so that we can lower that deficit and bring you a balanced budget in September as a preliminary budget. And still it's a work in progress. I think we've got it down to maybe 300,000 right now, but every day we look at things and look at those numbers, so.
Is that ESSER funding that went away and we continue with the success coaches, is that what's being referred to by staff as the structural deficit?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So it's not
So-
really a structural deficit, it's an additional, like some school districts spent ESSER funds on things and stuff, but we spent it on staff that don't go away. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have success coaches, but
Well, I will add that we knew this was running off. So that's why that cost was included in our operating referendum that we went out to in April. So we said, what of our ESSER spending was valuable? And everyone felt that those behavioral success academic coaches were valuable. So we knew that that would be an ongoing cost, and we figured that in when we did our ask for operating funds.
So that mitigates the impact of that
Mhm.
loss of ESSER funding to a certain extent,
Only till 29.
until 29, that's correct. Yep.
Mhm.
However, the ESSER funding runoff is greater than even that accounted for. And so we're not able to capture the full cost of that when the ESSER funding departed.
Mhm.
And this was, when we initially were working with ESSER funding, we hadn't offset our operating budget at all for most of that period of time. Ultimately, because our budget deficit is growing at such a rate because of declining enrollment and no state funding, the board approved using ESSER funding to alleviate that structural budget deficit for a year. And now we're on the back side of that and addressing it through our budget.
So I think might have been Trevor had reached out and talked about, because you hear a lot of districts that are facing this fiscal cliff because they didn't use their ESSER funds for extra things. They used them for just their regular staffing needs. And now there's no option, you
It's a
know?
bad plan.
Yeah.
For
I
any
can't think
kind of
of which
agency.
district just laid off.
Can't use one-time funds for ongoing costs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm. So
Call
then,
Rob and Peter to pay for Paul, but
yeah,
you have
yeah.
to eventually pay for Paul.
Yes, shouldn't put your groceries on the credit card if you can help it.
So we wanted to talk a little bit more about our internal budget process so that when it comes time for the board to really review the budget and approve it, that you have some idea of how we came about with these numbers. About four years ago, we went to zero-based budgeting, and we're gonna talk more about that. It's, we annually build our school and instructional budgets from zero process. And we estimate, you know, what of our costs are going to increase and where can we decrease them. But the real base of like the school and department budgets come from the experts that are using those. So why zero-based budgeting? I don't think they probably used this when Jim was here creating budgets.
Every other year it was implemented. This year we're gonna have to go zero-based budgeting.
But, so, but our staff is getting really good at it now, and they understand that it's, you know, that their budget each year is just not a carbon copy of their prior year budget. They have to really think about it. They're very much thought-based. It requires the department and school instructional team to figure out their needs. And then, first of all, it's based on instructional priorities, so that is why instructional priorities become part of our budget plan document. The zero-based budgeting allows for strategic funding to adapt to changing circumstances from year to year. So the state mandates a lot of things. They're mandating a change in reading curriculum. Those are all expenses to a district that are not funded. So, you know, we have to shift things to cover those curriculum expenditures. They allow each budget manager every year to reevaluate. What did they spend? What do they, maybe it was just a one-time expenditure this year. They don't need that money for next year. So they come very close or under whatever they think they need. However, if they know they have a greater need for something in the next year, they can put that in there as a need, and then they just need to justify that.
Sorry.
Mhm.
I was just gonna, am I correct in understanding that the zero-based budgeting kind of removes the incentive to spend down a budget at the end of the fiscal year, or you'll lose it?
Correct.
Right, okay.
Yes, we don't have any kind of carryover. Zero-based budgets are cost-effective and provide relevant and strategic allocation of planned spending. And zero-based budgets are aligned with our resources. They focus on our needs first, and it's, you know, pretty much our student needs. So, so what's the process? So in mid-February, we send out a zero-based budget workbook, and we send it to every principal and every department leader in the district. And in each workbook, the principal is provided with teacher request worksheets. So they send those out to their staff. So who knows better what you need in your classroom, right, than the teachers that are in that building. And then the principal evaluates their current year budget, reviews the teacher requests, estimates needed changes for next year's budget, and develops a school budget request for the following year. Then each of the instructional and each of the operational budget managers follows the same process. So Joe will go into and say, what am I expecting in expenditures for utilities and those kinds of things, and puts that in his budget. And then the process is completed by mid to late March. So they have a whole month to go through this process, really discuss things within their schools and departments, and make sure everybody is on the same page.
Doesn't seem like a month's that long when you're going through that kind of,
No.
I mean, there's a lot of heartache during that month, I'm sure, because you gotta cut.
Well, yes. And then they have to submit them to the district, where they get a second
Yeah.
scrutiny as far as the instructional and school budgets are reviewed by the instructional resource leadership team. So if they have any questions for those principals or department heads, they can reach out to them. They look at the priority relevance, the reasonability, affordability, and then we do the same thing on the operational side, and we review those too. So in all budgets, the needs are addressed first. And then
I
the
think
total.
an example where that comes to play is, I was just talking to AD over at Logan, I was talking about baseball, and their supply budget's $200, which will buy you a case of baseballs maybe, and it certainly won't buy you a baseball bat. And it's largely because the budgets of our athletic departments have been eaten up by transportation costs, referee costs, which have all been accelerating a lot faster. It's really hard to find refs. I mean, there's days we're afraid we won't be able to run games if somebody calls in sick. And so those costs have increased faster, and so we've had to make unfortunate, cost benefit decisions our ADs have on like where to spend those money. And, that's one of the places where these declining enrollments have hit us, is the things that kids love, the things that create belonging, the things that create community engagement, whether it's the performing arts or athletics, some of those things. And so
Or camping trips.
or
Mhm.
camping
That we saw
trips.
coming in.
Exactly, those extra things. And so,
Show
our ADs, our principals, our teachers are great advocates, and they're putting in their needs. They also have their list of wants, and we often can't get to the wants list when we're doing these processes, because some of these other costs that are out of our control just accelerate so fast.
And then the allocations are sent back to the schools and departments, where they put in the budget by line item. So we do not do that at the district office. So, so the budget development considerations. So just for all of you and your knowledge, the district's statewide. They're in this time of greater expectations and great budget constraints. The School District of La Crosse budget process is collaborative and student-focused. Much of the supporting budget information compiled in the plan document is brought to the board on various dates before September. The budget process is a best estimate of the resources and costs necessary to operate the school district for the upcoming school year. From May until October, when the board adopts the 24-25 original budget, the district will continue to focus on impactful assumptions and make adjustments until the preliminary budget is given to you in September. So then, in mid-October, there's a budget hearing that's held based on the preliminary budget. We post that in the newspaper. We have to by law. And so we post the date of the budget hearing, and people can come and discuss that budget with you if they so care to. And then before November 1st, it's the obligation of the board to approve the original budget. That will be updated based on the September 3rd Friday count, the staffing changes, private school vouchers, and the property value aid certification revenue limit. So There's lots of information that doesn't come
So-
until October.
Yeah, so tell us, examples, when French was cut or ag classes were added, what information comes to the board between now and when we get a budget that is a big thick document that we need to approve? How do we provide meaningful input in this process?
Sure, so when we say we're sending things out to the schools, they know by that time who registered for what classes. And if there's not an interest in a class, we can't support a teacher for that class, because there may be more interest in another area where we'd have to have the expense of that teacher.
And then how are decisions for adding program areas?
Same way, same idea, they're proposed and, because of student interest.
So with agriculture, for example, the school board, through its policies, has dictated that we should offer a comprehensive education that meets our students' needs through I'm summarizing a lot of policy there. And so we take the experts in our buildings, our principals, our directors, our supervisors, who understand kind of what a comprehensive education looks like, and who are listening to kids every day express their interests, and then try and meet those needs as we move forward. So an ag program is something that had been missing in our school district for many years, and when you look at particularly the south portion of our school district, there's a lot of rural areas. As I've thought about our school district, we're as much rural as we are urban. Now, where the students live is certainly more urban, but we've got a lot of dairy farms and agriculture and forestry and fisheries with the river and everything. And so that was an opportunity that our students didn't have to explore, because we didn't have an ag program.
So those decisions are all made by staff
Mhm.
administratively. So when parents hear that a program's been cut, and then they hear another one's been added, and then they complain to the school board members, we're like, well, we don't know anything, we had no, how does that work? Because we're the ones who get the complaints.
While-
But the
while-
justification is that the people on the ground are saying there wasn't enough interest to sustain this as good budgetary practice.
Right,
I'm like,
but we
know that
don't
people who
even
love
know.
it, love it.
The decision was made, we don't know anything about it until we hear the complaint from the families. That's, I
We
think-
send out updates to the school board through board reports and board updates, and we kept the board involved along the way with both French and ag and all those other things. It's up to me as the superintendent to be your communicator so that you're aware of the things that are going on, and I do my best to capture those things on a regular basis. There's so much going on in the school district of La Crosse, I certainly can't, relate all of it to you all the time. However, the big things that would come before a school board, that we could reasonably assume would come here as a public complaint, we try and let folks know. French was certainly one of those, ag program was another. Those are key critical developments that the board should be aware of, and I hope that I've done that, and if I haven't, I certainly, look forward to redirection to do better.
I wasn't here during those, I was just using them as examples.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, and so you wouldn't have been privy to that board correspondence, so that's understandable.
But I think to your point, we have to explain that we set the policy for the district and we don't micromanage who teaches what. And who teaches what depends on, I imagine those classes actually get brought forward because teachers propose them. That's been my experience as a teacher. If I wanted to teach creative writing, I went to my principal and said, I'd like to teach creative writing. I had 20 kids sign up that they might take it, and then they let me run it for a trial year, and if it fills, I get to keep it, and if it doesn't fill, I don't get to keep it. Some of the discussion with the people who were coming for French too, it was sad, but it seemed like a lot of it was there had been a phenomenal French teacher who was a real leader in the community and had built a huge program, and everybody wanted to take her class. And so, I don't know, it gets to be a burden on teachers again too, but you kind of, as a teacher, if you want that
Yeah.
program, you have to build it.
Another example would be a forensics class that we're offering now. Kids' interests shift over time, what our landscape looks like over time. In my chair as a superintendent, I'm not the best person to decide what kids are interested in right now. It's the teachers that are seeing them in their biology classes, listening to the conversations, doing professional development, networking with peers across the state and the country. Those are the folks that know what our kids need. And so we listen to them as we're developing programs. They, like Dr. Garcia mentioned, they put forward the course requests we certainly review them to make sure that it's within our budget to be able to execute. And then we shift and adjust our schedules to meet students' needs as we go along. And if agriculture for some reason didn't show popularity, we would end the program and move on to something else.
I didn't know show choir existed before Clee. But I bet a bunch of high schools had show choir programs after that started.
Mr. Magnuski?
How do you, we had zero-based budget, and then there were some complaints across the state of Wisconsin because Principal X in school thought the most important thing in that school, the staff, were library books. Another school across the street wanted technology. So then there was an imbalance between, and parents complained, we want some technology, why don't we have technology? We want books. I mean, so that happened between north side and south side. Who would, the principal and the staff, what did they want in zero-based budgeting? So there became an imbalance in this. So how do you somewhat ensure that the balance is kept?
Well, we have technology department now, so that oversees
I know, but
all
there's
of
something else coming on.
all of our district. So if you think about it, though, the school budgets are very small in relation, right? But we have other funding sources for a lot of those things, like, you know, technology has to be uniform,
Yeah.
district-wide, right? So I don't think we see those imbalances anymore as far as all of our students have one-to-one technology, so
I think
But
everybody.
that was an example. I mean,
Mhm.
there could
Totally.
be 13 other examples. So the question is, how do you keep it equitable between schools? And that is based on staff somewhat
Mhm.
and building principals' thought process. Somebody could be very music-oriented, I may be more technology education or something, so I wanna invest in technology because I think, so that was my point.
I'd
Yeah,
say
I
his-
think because we get to that next level of the instructional team over, you know, looking at those, so, you know, we have our directors of secondary and elementary ed, so they can kind of talk about that, because what might happen is maybe one school has a higher need for something, but as the group of principals, they can say, well, this year you can have that amount, you know, like it's the same thing with the state aid. It's a bucket of money, right? And how it's dispersed evenly. We also have our associate superintendent, who is, you know, the superintendent of instruction, we have our site-based, you know, plans, you know, for improvement. And so he has money in his budget allocated as far as poverty levels in the elementary schools, and I think the middle and high school also. So there's certain things that they can tap into for certain needs like that outside of their school budgets.
But
I
it,
think-
it also sounds like there are checks within the process of figuring out wants and needs that are coming from individuals in the district who are not tied to the interest of a particular building. Who, like, if one school is wanting to go, I think I'm trying to understand your
And that's the
hypothetical
way it
here.
was.
Right, and so there are checks not tied to an individual building to say, well, we wanna try to keep the district in.
There's more or less guardrails and
Yeah.
stuff, you know,
Yeah.
there's, you can
Is
go
that-
one way, but there's always
Yeah.
check
This
and balance.
district,
But that is totally, you know, that happened a lot.
Sure.
I mean, and let's be honest with you, there's gonna be a teacher that squeaky wheel gets the oil, and if they're really driven for one special, you know, I wanna get a class to speak Czechoslovakian, you know, and
might be able to make
they're
it.
really for it, you know, they could get it, but the problem is it might only be 1 year, because if only 2 people do it, it's gonna be a, you know, quick turn, but that eliminates somebody else's opportunity also, so I think, to Jim's point too, there has to be some way, and it
Yeah.
sounds like there's guardrails
That was
there.
my only point.
Mhm,
Yeah,
mhm.
because somebody could really throw us way off base.
I do think I see a lot more in this district than other districts I've been a part of, a lot more cooperation between campuses and collaboration between campuses to make sure our theater programs or that camping program or other things like that, those opportunities are available to students, no matter what building they're in.
Yep.
We we are fortunate to have
That's great.
really good collaboration amongst our principals at this point, and our directors of elementary and secondary education have really brought them all together. Those have been really valuable positions for some of that kind of screening. But our principals are talking to each other. They know how much is spent in that building and how much is
And
spent
then-
in this
and
one.
Then the off center was also the amount of money that some schools got from their PTA or PTO.
Oh, sure.
This budget
Yeah.
there, I said, how the heck could you spend that much money on that? Well, our PTA gave it to us. The PTA I was working with only had $30. So there's that also.
That is a source of inequitable funding that is hard for us to address, because it's the
No,
donations
I
of
got it.
private.
Capitalism.
Fortunately, what we have seen is that our community really wraps around those buildings that need it the most, and maybe it's not a PTO, but local businesses will
Yeah,
contribute.
nonprofit.
Yeah, exactly.
So the board approves the budget, but essentially it's somewhat perfunctory because the decisions on staffing, what contracts are released, what programs are done, that's all done, that's already been done before we even got this presentation today. When we approve the budget, it's just perfunctory. We're not providing really any oversight or anything, right?
No,
I mean, 'cause
think
all those
we're-
decisions, I mean,
We're
those-
giving it to the superintendent who we, you know,
Yeah.
had, and
But
he's the one
statute-
who
I mean,
puts it
then-
down.
But we're approving, I mean, it's,
And so we're looking at the budget each year and looking at like line by line, are our costs in one area ballooning in a way that is, indicates a problem, right?
But our budgets start with school board policy.
Right.
We are trying to execute your vision for the school district. You want us to improve test scores. You want kids to be engaged in the environment. You want students to be able to have jobs and be prepared for the workplace. So all of those things, we're trying to filter into what that looks like using the experts that we've hired in our school district, the people that are closest to it. Ms. Sprang talked about at the top, why are we doing this? It's about educational opportunities for students, and your policy directs us. And obviously, you're not getting into the weeds, because how could you? There's just so much here. It's a $110 million budget. I can't get into the weeds either. I've got to trust the people underneath me to make good decisions. I'm not getting into elementary budgets or what's going where. That's why we hire good people to do those jobs.
We want students to have a sense of belonging, and our extracurriculars fund that, right? We spend
Right.
money
Right.
to have
And we
something.
also require
Yeah.
a balanced budget. There are things that you're not allowed to do. Right.
Well, $200 for a baseball team, I don't know what kind of extracurricular
No,
budget
no.
that is.
That, I
but-
wasn't thinking of
Yeah.
that one, but
Yeah.
But that's just a small part of the budget.
No, I know.
Actually, our
So-
activities
I was
So
thinking
not-
about the
Quite a
program, it's
large
like the ag
budget.
program. a little bit.
But
They just have to manage it.
to Deb's point, though, like the oversight happens throughout the year in our reporting as we're holding you accountable to achieving our.
OE5,
our policy.
OE6, it's all about financial planning and then financial accountability. OE4 is our personnel administration. Are we meeting your needs on the HR side? Instructional, there's.
It
And the
does,
work-
but we don't know, again, we
Yeah.
don't know if they're robbing from Peter to pay for Paul.
Yeah.
We know the budget they're gonna get in, all we care about is if they stay into that budget. I mean, they could decide to, take money from Luigi's Farm Club and give it to Roy's, muffler shop, and, to funnel that money over to, we don't know. I mean, there's no one here, obviously,
If
the
they did off that
principals and
books,
stuff will know.
if they did that off the books, we wouldn't know.
Right, I mean, but I think to Jim's point,
Right, we-
that is
Well, let me-
100%
let me
correct,
just-
that that
let's-
stuff happens.
I'm gonna calm your fears. So we have another fund, Fund 21. You guys get the list of donations every month, and all those donations, whether it's from an activities or PTO, they're all run through that fund, and they are highly regulated as far as whatever that donation was for, that expense has to match what the person or entity
So-
That's
gave
the
it.
Audit every year too.
So,
And I would bet money
so
on
just- so a
when
couple-
the teachers are spending their money.
a couple of years ago, a teacher request at one of the elementary schools was for a couple $100, like $340 or something, for like flexible seating options, that I presume were put forward as a want or a need for the classroom that was not ultimately approved in the budget. And then, they asked the PTO to provide that money, which they did. That would go to Fund 21 first, okay.
Yeah, and it would be spent out of there too.
Right.
So, and the other thing is we have the foundation. Don't forget, we have, you know, all those Gold Star grants. Those are the above, you know, over and above, right? To
Mhm.
enhance their learning.
And you have soup.
Yes?
Lacrosse
Mhm.
soup's wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
This district, I mean, if you just look at a donations list
It's a
every
generous
month,
district.
we are very lucky to have such a generous community that supports public education.
Typically $20,000 to $50,000 a month
Mhm.
donations from our community.
Yeah.
We are fortunate, that's for sure.
Mhm. Yes.
And we're probably trying to wrap this up, but, was there ever, or is there ever a discussion in Wisconsin to combine mass transit with school busing? I go to city meetings and we're always talking about lack of ridership on the MTU.
Mhm.
Well, does the MTU ever have a possibility of delivering kids to school and we work together with that?
We do already. We have bus passes that we buy for some students to ride the city buses. And our, Joel Davina and Jeff Elson, who is our transportation manager, are in discussions with them all the time
Good.
to provide more, you know, collaboration. Mhm.
Then you're getting city and that gets ugly too, as we all know.
So long as they don't let the Catholics ride.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
Most of our students, I mean, in town, most students live within 2 miles, and so transportation is not, you know, provided unless they live in a hazardous area. It's mostly our outlying areas or students that are transferring between programs, you know, they live in the south side but want to go to Cooley Montessori, and so we're trying to ensure that they get to their school.
I have just one last quick question, sorry, Patty. So if I'm reading the second to last slide here on development considerations,
Yep.
we won't know the actual impact of the school voucher program until November 1st or after November.
Well,
Or excuse me,
in
before
October.
November.
Mhm. In
With the
October.
preliminary budget and the third
And
Friday.
that is given to us by the state, and we don't know who those students are. And-
Or if they remain in the private schools that they receive the
Right,
voucher.
those dollars will go directly to the private schools, and even if the student comes back to the public school, the funding stays with the private school.
It's that third Friday count that drives everything.
Yes. Yes. So, there you have it. We're gonna go forward, and if you have any questions as we go along, but you're gonna see things this summer that refer to the budget plan, and they might not even have numbers in it, but they are supporting those dollars, you know.
Yeah, thank you, Patty.
As we
You're
can
welcome.
see, it's a
Very good
simple,
support.
it's a simple process to talk about school finance.
That's why they call it the puzzle.
Yeah, but, all right, any other questions? If not,
Thank you.
then we are
Thank
adjourned.
you.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.